The talk of the town. Life stories from the people who lived them. The story of Brenda Kelly.
I was born on the 17th of July 1932 in Ripon Street in Blackburn. And my father was a manager at Waterfall Mill and my mother was a weaver. But my mother and father weren't together very long after my sister was born. She was born 30th of March 1935. My mother and father separated and divorced. Now, we lived with my grandmother from then on, up to me being 17. And during those years, my grandmother looked after us. We went to school, came home, she made all our meals. My mother then worked at ROS. And anyway, what happened then, when I was 17, well, up to being 17, my mother once met my father and made me go every Saturday to meet him. I didn't know him then properly, but she made me go, and I didn't want to go because I always believed in what you've never had, you never miss. So that when I went to see him, I had to go every Saturday morning without fail, and my mother, I'd go home and she'd quiz me about him. And when I went to see him, he quizzed me about her. Till I got it in my head, I thought, well, I'm like a go-between. So I just turned on and I said, I'm not going anymore. So when I was 17, I didn't go anymore. And then my mother married again. I left my grandmother and we went to live up Highcroft in Lytham Road. And I lived there until I got married in 1959. And I met Bernard, my husband. I met him in June of 1958. And I got engaged in July 1958. And I got married February 21st, 1959. And then in June 1960, I had a daughter and she was stillborn, 24th of June. Then, 4th of September 1961, I had another daughter, Barbara. Then I had a son, 26th of September 1962. Then I had a daughter, Susan, born 26th of December 1964. Now, when I had Barbara and John, they went out to nursery and I went out part-time working with a friend of mine. We went to Queen's Park Hospital and worked a day shift between us, and we each looked after each other's children. We didn't pay any money, we just nursed each other's children. But when I had Susan, I stayed at home with Susan until she was ready for school. After she went to school, I went back to work. And, well, I worked up to being, 53 and started having arthritis in my hands. Because I worked on a counter where you keep going in a freezer. And I went to work one morning and somebody said, "What's wrong with your hands?" which I hadn't noticed. And when I looked, they were up here, like pudding. And I went to my doctor and he put me on sick for 26 weeks, but I haven't worked from that day to this. And when I was married to Bernard, we were married for 43 years and he died 6th of October 2002 and he was 75. And we had a good life between us. And my children, well, they were worth bringing up. They've always been good, good children when we were younger, and they are now. I mean, they don't forget a birthday or an anniversary. Well, I don't have an anniversary as such, but when I did, they never forgot one. And I always get a birthday, and they do from me. We've always done the same, and if they meet anybody and they start going out with them, which they've done in the time, I've done the same for them. We've never left anybody out. Only Susan had her birthday 26th of December, Boxing Day, and when they were younger, John and Barbara used to say, "Why is it she gets 2 presents at Christmas and we only get 1?" I said, "Well, you don't really." I said, "When it's your birthday, you get a birthday present." I said, "Now, when it's her birthday," I said, "she gets one." I said, "She also gets a Christmas present, like you do." I said, "But because her birthday's at Christmas, she gets hers both together." And I had to tell them this every year for I don't know how long. And in the end, I was going to say to them, "Now, we know." I said, "Oh," I said, "you've got the message." I said, "The penny's dropped at it." And they said, "Yeah." Well, they haven't bothered since, and I still do it. Christmas for Susan, 2 at Christmas, and then I buy lots of bits, but Susan always gets 1 for her birthday and her main 1 for her Christmas, apart from odd bits, But I had all that to go through, when they were younger. But I enjoyed it, and I was very lucky to have them because I was married late in life. Well, when I say that, I was 26 when I got married. Well, you're supposed to, they say, have them when you're younger and enjoy them, but I didn't get a chance, really. Like Susan had Damon, my grandson, when she was 21. So, I mean, she's had longer with him than what I've had with them. But what I've had with them, I've enjoyed, up to when Barbara got married and it didn't work out. I mean, it doesn't work out for everybody. I mean, you've these things to put up with. You don't know what you're walking into until you've done it, and then you suddenly find out. But as I say, I didn't have to go through that. I was very lucky. 43 years, and I enjoyed every minute of it. And I wish I could have them back. I do, really. I don't know what's going to happen now from now on. I mean, Susan's got married, she's been married over 10 years, and Barbara's met somebody now, and we don't know what's going to happen to that. We'll have to wait and see. And John, well, he got married, he's been married a little bit, near enough same time as Barbara. I think there'd be a year or so between them, and he has 2 boys. And he's done very well, but he doesn't live here. He lives in Scotland, and I only see him now and again, not very often. And he rings not very often. I mean, he's like, they say lads are like that. They're not as, as easy to... In fact, his wife has to nudge him to do it, and when he rings, he'll say, "Pauline asked me to ring you." So she shouldn't need to ask you should do it on your own. "I know, but you know what I'm like." I said, "Yes." I said, "So I've got used to it. I don't take any notice of it." And Susan I see every Thursday after work. She comes round about 4:30 and has a brew with me and stays for an hour or so. And then I see Barbara odd times. I don't see a lot of Barbara because she doesn't work in Blackburn anymore. I used to meet Barbara every Wednesday, and we used to go for a dinner together. We used to go in the 8 boat and have a dinner together every week. But now she's working at Burnley, is it? She works, so I don't see much of her. But I said I'm thankful when I do, because Susan will say, "Have you heard from Barbara? Have you seen Barbara?" And I said, "No." I said, "But it's not so long since I rung her." I rung her and she said, "Oh, I'm all right." And I asked how Ken was. And I said, and she said, "Oh, he's just walked in." She said, "Are you all right?" I said, "Yeah." I said, and that's it. We didn't have a lot of conversation, but we did go out when Susan went away for a fortnight. We went to Hornside and we went to Grange over Sand, and I enjoyed it. In fact, I was in bed at 9 o'clock. I'd had that much fresh air, which I don't have a lot of these days, but I enjoyed it. Really good day. I did enjoy it. I like going out like that sometimes. It was a nice surprise anyway, because I didn't know I was going in the first place. So, and I'm hoping I can do it again sometime. You know, it's nice to go out for a change. But I haven't been out for a long time, not as I used to do. We used to go out 3 times a week. But since I've had this arthritis, I haven't been able to walk far. But I've got myself a walker, and I'll be able to walk with it. And if I get tired, I can have a sit down. And that's what they're for. It's got a seat on. So if I walk and I get tired, I'll think, well, I'll have a rest. I'll have a sit down for a little while. But you press 2 buttons, one at a time, and it comes off. Well, with her oiling it, I got one side off and I couldn't get the other off. Susan come and she pressed and it come up like that. She said, well, I've got it off. I said, well, it has been oiled, so that's why you've been able to, you know, take it off. And it's in there. I thought, well, it's there if I need it. You know what I mean? It'll help me, you know. Oh, it's awful when you lose your confidence. And Susan keeps saying, oh, why don't you go to town? And I said, at town? I said, I'd be up Florida before you can say Jack Robinson. She says, no, you wouldn't. She said, you'd be all right. I thought, you can get lost. I'm not trying it, because I'd be a bit nervous about it, you know. I said, I'm not doing it, no. I said, I'll leave it. And then I got this. So I'll see how I go on with this for a while. It's hard work when you're getting older. Good job you can't look round corners. It is, because you don't know what's coming. You don't. But never mind. But I'd go through it all again if I had the opportunity. If I could start again, I'd go through it all again. Because my husband, when I got married, well, Barbara knows, I never made a meal from the day I got married up to when he was taken ill. He won't let me go in the kitchen. It's my kitchen. He'd let me go make a brew, but he did all my cooking and he did all my baking. I never did anything like that. And at Sundays, we used to have no less than 12 people, and that didn't include him and me. That were my 3 and others, relations, every Sunday without fail. And he made meals for all them. And I used to go in and do the pots. And they used to sit here watching telly. That's what happened. But I never bothered, because I never bothered about washing up. I used to like it. I used to love it. And he'd come in and he'd say, I'll help you. I said, no, you did the cooking, I'll do the clearing away. And I did. And even when they were on him and me, there were only 2 plates, 2 knives and forks, 2 pots. He'd make the meal, we'd eat the meal, I'd go in and start washing up, and he'd come in and I'd say, what do you want? Oh, I've come in to dry. I said, dry? I said, I don't need these pots. I'll do it. And he used to stand with me and dry 2 plates, 2 pots, 2 lots of knives and forks. Said, now we've done that, we can go and have a sit down. He used to do all my cleaning, he used to hoover for me. He'd go and polish in the bedroom and I'd polish in here. And when he were ill, we went to see him and he said, are you going on with your cleaning and that? Of course I were on my own. I said, well, I'm managing. But the worst part was, after he died, it took me a while. I went off my food. I couldn't eat. I couldn't cook. I wanted to eat, but I couldn't do it. I were on my own and I could do it, but I didn't want it. It took me a while to get back. And Mark, my son-in-law, said, never mind, Mum, he said, you'll be all right, it'll come back eventually, which it did. In the end, I did. And I thought, well, he suffered enough. He suffered for over 12 months and he had cancer in his spine and in his left lung. But he knew when he went in hospital, they'd told him what he had. And he didn't mention it to me. The sister said to me, when you go in to see him, don't mention it. If he wants to tell you, he'll tell you. And he didn't tell me. You'd have thought he'd just had his appendix out. We went in to see him. He didn't say it to me, and I never said it to him. We never mentioned, even up to, well, he was on morphine in the end. They put him on morphine, and he was away. He was unconscious, really, when he died on the Sunday, and it was 2:45 at Sunday afternoon on 6th of October when he died. And he kept trying to take his mask off. And Barbara said, leave it on, Dad. That's what it's for, it'll do you good. And he took it off and he said something to Barbara, but I didn't hear it because he turned to her. She was on one side, I was on the other. And when we were coming out, I said, what did your dad say to you when he was talking? She said he turned to me and he said, God bless you all. And I didn't know what to do. I didn't say anything really. I just looked at her and I carried on walking. But when I came home here, Susan brought me home and I said, I can't stop here. As soon as I walked in and I knew where he were, I mean, we used to visit him. We visited him every day when he were in hospital. But when he'd gone, I knew I couldn't go and visit. So I said to Sue, I can't stop here. I said, no, she said, get your bedding and come with me. And I went for a week, from the Sunday to the following Sunday. I went to Susan's and they did all my running about. I didn't go. He was in Royal Preston Hospital when he died, and her and Mark, they had to identify him. And they brought all his belongings home to me. I didn't do a thing, I just sat indoors and they did it. I came home the following Sunday and they, while I was in their house, they come here and emptied my wardrobe and my cupboards and drawers of the belongings of his. I never saw any of it. And then I came home the following Sunday and I've been here ever since, and I've the thing that brought me around were that he'd suffered enough and I didn't like to see him. I didn't want to see him suffer anymore. He'd had enough, so I was thankful really that he'd gone, and that was the only thing that more or less brought me round. I wouldn't like to see anybody else like that. It's horrible to watch. However, as I say, I've got over it and life has to go on. You can't stop just because of things like that. You have to look after yourself, really. When that happens, you haven't much choice. No point in letting yourself go and, I mean, you can't do that. Holidays, what we had. I've only ever been abroad once, and it was in the 1970s, and there was Bernard and myself and Susan. We went to Spain and we went to Lloret de Mar, and I didn't like it. Went for a fortnight. I didn't like the food, I couldn't get right with that. Although we could have had English meals. The only thing I liked was the coffee. They made a good cup of coffee, but as for the meals, I couldn't face the meals. I had to go out and find a place where I like to know what I'm eating. But mostly we used to go to went to his mother's when his mother was alive. And then he had a brother, Roy. In fact, he was one of 10 children he had. There were 5 brothers and 5 sisters altogether. Now, one of his brothers, Roy, well, he had something wrong with one leg, and in 1 month, both himself and his wife, they died. His wife had breast cancer and she went into one hospital, and he started being ill and he had to have a colostomy, and he was in another hospital. And the week before he died, they put him in the same hospital together, but she never got to go to his funeral. He died, she went back to her other hospital, and in the same month we'd been to his funeral, come home, gone back to her funeral in 1 month, and they had one son, and when they died he was 21, and he's more or less the same age as Barbara. There's only a few months between them. He's nearly 46, I think. I don't think he's as old as Barbara. I think he's a bit younger than her. But I always stayed, when I went to Hastings, apart from going to his mother's, we always stayed with Roy and Pam. Those are the two that died. I used to go and I used to love going to them. And they had a flat, but I called it an upside down flat because where you have a flat, well, it were a house really, but it was funny to me because when you went to bed, you went downstairs. And when you went to your living room, you went upstairs. It were sort of upside down, but it was a lovely place to stop at. And it was the only place that I would stop. I never stopped with anybody else. We'd go and visit everybody else, but I wouldn't dream of going and stopping with them for a holiday. And after they died, I never went anymore. Now, as I say, we're 21 and he's more or less 46, as old as Barbara. So that's more or less 24 years, near enough, since they've gone. And they've all gone now. Now there's only there's 2 girls and 2 boys left. That's all. They've all gone apart from that. But, of course, nobody lives forever. And I wouldn't like to do either. I don't think I fancy that myself. But those are really, that's what I used to do for holiday. We didn't go away as such because when we were younger we had children, 3, and there weren't much between any of them really. There were only 12 months in Barbara and John, and Susan was 1964, so there weren't a right lot of, space in between them. But no, we didn't go on any holiday. We take them to Hastings when we went, but that was more or less the only place that we did go. We didn't go, and we couldn't afford these holidays what they have today because your money didn't spin out. I mean, when he were working, when I stayed at home with Susan as a child, when she was a child, well, he worked at infirmary and there were 5 of us to keep and he were on £23 a week. Well, when you look at £23 a week today, it's not spending money. Not for anybody these days. I mean, nobody would live on that money today, although people used to think it went further. It might have done. But I mean, these days, younger ones, if my young ones got an apple and orange, they were satisfied. But this day and age, they want computers and all these different sorts of things. My grandson, Damon, he had everything that they had in Dixon's window. But in the end, he got bored. He used to play with different things and I'd say, why don't you do so? Oh no, I'm bored. It's the trouble is, this day and age, I wouldn't like to be one of these growing up today. I mean, there were no such thing as drugs and whatever were going on that shouldn't have been, you didn't see much of. I mean, for instance, you could go out, you could leave your front doors open, you'd go anywhere, and you could come home and there wouldn't be a thing out of place. Now, you can't do that today. No chance. You have no chance this day and age. I mean, and now, well, they give you 50 words for one. If anything goes wrong and you go out and try to tell somebody off, they turn on you and give you a load of bad language, that you'd never hear of at one time. We didn't behave like they do today. I wouldn't be one of this lot for all England. I wouldn't. No, I wouldn't like to have to bring anybody up today. Oh, it's terrible. It is. It's terrible. I had a couple of different jobs. I worked at hospital, Queen's Park, on a part-time basis, and a friend of mine, Annie Bond, he used to call her Auntie Annie. She lived 3 doors away from me, and we each looked after each other's children. When I did a morning shift, she did an afternoon shift, and the week after we changed round. But there were no money pots between us. Now, my job, I was an auxiliary and so was Anne, and it were a geriatric ward, and there were more or less, some were in bed, some we had to get up in the morning. And I had one funny incident one day, because if you got a patient that died during the night, I mean, they were all getting on, they're 80s and 90s, they were all really old ladies, you know. Now you'd go in every morning and the night staff would say, oh, such a body's died, but they didn't do anything about it, they left it to day staff. Anyway, it happened one day, and we'd to lay this body out, you see. But when I did, first time I did it, the sister on the ward shouted, she said, how are you going on? She said, Kelly. She said, they didn't call you by your first name, you always got your last name. And she said, is it bothering you? I said, I haven't time to bother, because you're at one bed and then another. You haven't time to worry about it in between, you just kept going. Well, when this lady died, I went with a nurse. You always had to go with a nurse, you know, and we laid this lady out. But sometimes when you moved them, they used to groan. It were like wind, if you want. You used to move them and you know, they used to make a noise. Anyway, one day I did it, and during the afternoon when it were visiting time, there were a visitor came in, and she came to me and she said, can I ask you a question? I said, yeah. I said, what? She said, well, you know when you come in and somebody's died and you have to lay them out and you have to have your breakfast? I said, yeah. I said, well, what's wrong? She said, what do you do? I said, well, you come in and somebody's died, so you lay them out, you wash your hands and you go and have your breakfast. I said, and when I looked, she's flat out on the floor. She fainted. She fainted. I said, and I shouted, and everybody come and look. And sister says, what's happened? What have you done? I said, well, I didn't knock her out. She asked me, and I told her. I never got over that. I never forgot that, because it never happened before and it's never happened since, you know. But it was funny, really, to me, after I'd looked back on it, because you don't expect people to do that. But she did ask me, so I told her and never thought about it, you know. But I worked like that. I worked there for 8 years. And then my son, as a child, he had asthma bad. And one week I had to stop at home with him to look after him. And, well, I stopped at home, and at night time he used to have pillars behind him, 67, windows open, it'll rain, snow and blow, fry his balsam under his bed to help him to breathe. The things I went through with that lad, you'd never believe. Now, I had a week at home with him, and I went back to work, and they sent for me in the office. And he asked the boss, that's why I'd been at home, and I told him, I said I had a son, very poorly. I said he had asthma, he couldn't breathe. Well, he said, I think these patients are more important than your son. I said, oh, I said, do you? I said, you know what you can do with your job, don't you? I said, and I walked out and I never went back anymore. I said, and I went home. I said, and Bernard were home because he were on shift work. I said, and when I walked in, he said, what are you doing at home? And I told him. I said, he said, well, you've just done right. I said, well, I said, I've been at home all week. We ain't, I said, I think that were enough for me. I said, without having to go back to work and listen to that. So I said, I'm here, I come home. And then I worked at Tesco on a till, and I worked in Booths on a till, for a few years. And when I worked there, that's when I started with the hands, because we had a deep freeze. I was on a meat counter and we were in and out of this deep freeze to get this meat ready for when we opened up, and that was what caused it. We keep going in there and getting cold, and I never worked from that day to day. But I like working at hospital. I enjoyed that up to that day, and then I had that good laugh with that lady, but I never expected that when she said that. It was funny. Yeah, I enjoyed it, and I had a spell I worked with Bernard at English Electric. We worked there, and I enjoyed that as well. I worked there when I was having Susan, and that's when I stopped at home and I didn't go back to work till she went back to school. It was after Susan went to school that I went back to work. I did all these other jobs, you know. But I haven't worked since I was about 53, so that's a few years. And I've got used to it. But when you're at home, it's surprising. When you're working, you know what day it is. But when you're at home, when Bernard was with me, every day he'd say, "What day is it?" I'll say, "It's Tuesday." "Oh, all right." Day after, "What day is it?" I said, "Wednesday." Well, this went on and I got fed up. So he said one day, "What day is it?" I said, "It's the day after yesterday." And he says, "Well, to be honest," he said, "I'll tell you what it is." He said, "When you're working, you know what day it is. When you come to be at home, every day is the same." And he came to be at home because he had an accident at work once when he worked at Prestige. I didn't, he did. And he had an accident. He slipped going down some steps on some oil and he hurt his back, and he had to have what they called a laminectomy on his back. And when he came home, he was in bed, had to get his bed down, and he was there for 18 weeks and got up and he said one day, "I'm going for a walk." And I was a bit worried about it because it was the first time he'd been out, and I said, "I'll come with you." No, I'll go on my own." And he went out on his own and I was a bit bothered. But he came back, but he'd been in trouble with it ever since, up to when he was taken ill. And he used to go even here. He used to go outside, and he did one day, he loved gardening, and he had a garden, 2 gardens. And I heard him shout and I had to go in. He said he only bent down to pick a brick up and he was on his hands and knees. And in the end, my son-in-law, Barbara's husband then, got a chair for him, one of them that lifts up, to help him. And he used to switch it on and it used to vibrate depending on which part of your back you wanted to use it. And he used to use that and it used to ease it. But he never worked from 1972. And as I say, he died in 2002, so he had a good innings at home, you know. He didn't like being at home. I mean, nobody does. I had to finish work before I should have done. But if it's meant for you, you get it. And if it's not, you don't. It's as simple as that. I don't know. A lot of it I go through again. Especially in my 42 years, I would. 43 years, I would. I'd have that all again. Not because he did everything for me, because I don't think I could have met a better one. And I met him on a blind date anyway. I mean, I didn't know him from Adam. And when he came here to Blackburn from Hastings, he was born 1927, and he came here in 1947 because he couldn't get work at home because they only worked seasonal in Hastings. So he came here and he had a sister lived here because she married a man that was in the RAF. And when he came out of the RAF, he went working for Lloyd's in Bennington Street, long distance. Now, Bernard came to Blackburn in 1947 and he went to live with his sister and her husband, and he went to work for Lloyd's. He was a long-distance driver for a long time. Even when we got married, he was a long-distance driver. It was only after I started having these children that he went indoors. He'd always been driving. For years he did that, and he liked doing it, but I didn't like it because he used to be away such a lot. And he used to make me laugh. He'd come home with the wagon sometime, and he could hear it coming up the hill. And I were working every day then. Well, could I get asleep? He woke me up with this noise. And all of a sudden, when I heard him come in and I'd smell bacon. And I used to think, 2 o'clock in the morning, this, bacon. And he'd come upstairs, pint pot. He wouldn't have a little cup, he always had a pint pot of tea, plate full of bacon butters, and he'd get in bed and sit up in bed, and he'd be saying, he knew how we were eating, he'd say, do you want a bacon butter? I told him I want to go to sleep, I have to get up for work in the morning. And he did that every time when he come home. I used to wait for it. Bacon, you could smell it all over the place, But anyway, that was the only thing I didn't like. He used to go away and he'd be away for a few days. And then one day I got a telegram and it frightened me to death. I wouldn't open it. And I run across the road to a lady and I get it her, a neighbour. And I said, will you open this? I said, I don't open it. Anyway, she opened it, and what had happened, he'd had a puncture. Well, there were big wheels, what they had, and he had to take it into a garage and have it. So he'd sent me this message to say, I said, oh, thank God for that. I said, I didn't open it when I got it. I said, I didn't know what it would be. I didn't like telegrams at that time, Anyway, everything worked out all right, but, I don't know. We've had some fun and games in a time. We used to like wrestling when we were first married. Well, before we got married. We used to go to King George's and watch Les Kellogg. He was a wrestler. I used to love it. I used to watch him. He was more of a comedian than a wrestler. He was really funny, And we went to a cinema now and again, but I didn't like to go to a cinema with Bernie because he never saw a film. He used to fall asleep. We'd sit there and I'd look at him and be hard and fast asleep. And I used to say, well, there's not much point in coming here if you're going to do that, I said, no. He said, I used to do this when I was with my brothers, when he were at home. He said, we used to go out. He said, and we might go to a cinema or whatever. Everywhere I went, I used to go to sleep. I said, I bet you didn't go to sleep when you went for a drink. He said, no. He said, but I couldn't keep up with my brothers, and they used to have a tin and they'd put money in, and he'd say, I'm not putting any money in. I'll buy my own and you buy what you want. He said I couldn't keep up with them, and they used to drink cider. Well, he said it knocked you unconscious. He said, you think I'm going on cider? He'd say, you want off, I'm not, I don't want it. I'll drink what I want to drink, and you can get as drunk as you want. You drink what you want. He said, I did that because I couldn't keep up. And he's never been a drinker. He was never a drinker. Even when he was with me, he was never, And when I first met him, I played piano all my life, more or less. I got it from my father. He played when I were only young, and I used to play with my chin just underneath the piano keys and play like this. And everybody that I met used to say, how do you do it? How do you know where to put your fingers? I said, well, I don't know, I can't tell you that. I said, it just happens. I said, it's just one of them things. Well, when I met Bernard, how I did, he worked with this bloke, long distance, and one night I was with my mother. I'd been engaged once before, and I broke it off, and I didn't go out a lot after that. And one night I were in with my mother, and this knock came to my door, and it were the mate that he worked with, long distance. Clifford Harvey he was called. And he came in and I said, "What's wrong?" He says, "I've come, I want to know if you'll come and play piano for a 21 birthday party. It's at such a place." I said, "Oh, yeah, all right then." He said, "Well, I haven't a lot of time to talk to you now. I'm going to work." So he went. Now, I worked with his wife. When I went to work, I said, "Cliff had been to see me the night before." She said, "I knew he was coming." She said, "What did he want?" I said, "Well, he asked me if I'd play piano for a 21." And she laughed. And I said, "Well, what are you laughing at?" She said, "Oh, nothing of the sort." I said, "Well, what's he want?" She said, "Well, we go out at weekends." She said, "And we have his mate that he works with. He comes with us." She said, "And he turned on us one day. He said, 'I'm not going with you anymore.' He said, 'I feel like a gooseberry.' He said, 'I don't like it.' He said, 'It's not right that I should go with you.' He said, 'I'm going to go out on my own.' Anyway, that was what he wanted. He wanted me to go and make a four up. And I kept saying, 'Oh, I don't know.' Anyway, I went home and I mentioned it to my mother and she said, 'Get out,' she said. She says, 'You've never been out for ages.' As I say, I got engaged and I broke it off once and I stayed in for a while. And she said, 'You haven't been out for a while. Get out,' she said. 'You can't stop him forever.' And I met him. He'd gone an errand. And he said, 'We'll meet you on Darwin Street.' I was stood in the doorway because it started raining. And when I met him, we went to a pub to have a drink. And I played piano. While we were in there, they got me playing piano. And he couldn't get over it. He loved it. He said, 'I like music.' 'Oh, I love music,' he said. During the time we'd been married, I had a piano in my own. We bought one. And I played at King George's, different concerts. There were concert parties years ago when I was younger, and I used to play it when I went with them. But he liked music. And when I met him, the same night I met him, he went home with me. His friend, he didn't have a car, but his friend had a car, and he said, "You take my car, you take Brenda home, and bring the car in the morning and pick me up to go to work." It was no different because Cliff used to take Bernard to work. So he took me home, and when I went indoors, he said, "I'm not stopping here, I'm coming in." And he walked in with me, and my mother, they had a tile fireplace. She lived up Higher Croft, and they had a tile fireplace. And she just made a pot of tea. And he saw this pot of tea, and he says, "Oh," he said, "have you made that for me? Thank you very much." And he picked it up and drank it. Well, my mother stood there with her mouth open. She didn't know what to say, but eventually she went and made another one. And we were together after that, well, all them years, over 40 years. I mean, and it only took a cup of tea, and he were in. He drank it. But I don't know. Yeah, he were long distance for a long time. I didn't like it at all. Man, I used to go in the wagon sometimes. I went to Leeds, they were delivering eggs one. He went local in the end, different places local. And I've been to London. And we used to go in these cafes where long distance drivers went, and I used to go in and have the same meals as they did, you know. I don't know. I enjoyed it though. I used to enjoy it, the ground. I was only 13 when the war finished. I don't remember a great deal about it, really. But all I do remember, we could hear aeroplanes. They used to drone. For like there was a space in between. And as far as away as Manchester, you could hear them from there. And there were one came down Penny Street in Blackburn and dropped bombs on a tram. They saw this light going along, they didn't know it was a tram, but they dropped these bombs and blew this tram to smithereens. It come down Penny Street one. But as for war itself, I don't remember much about it because I weren't old enough really, to remember that. No, I don't. We used to wear a gas mask, I don't remember that. We used to have a gas mask in a box, we had to carry it round. And I didn't like wearing it because you couldn't get your breath. Everything, you used to sweat a lot with being rubber. You put it on and you just had like a long thing that you could see out of. Well, the longer you had it on, you used to sweat. And then they used to run us into air raid shelters, practice. And then you'd hear sirens going. And then you'd have to go in, but you didn't see anything. You could hear planes, but you never saw any. We never saw any. I think they went to Liverpool and they went to Manchester. And London was the worst place that they bombed. But we were very lucky, we didn't see any bombing at all. Only that incident with that tram in Penny Street, but other than that, we didn't hear much about it. We did more practicing when we were children than what, like Bernard, when he was a child, they were evacuated to Weston-super-Mare when he was a child, and he didn't like it. He used to tell me a different thing, and he said they went in one place, and they went in this bedroom, and when they woke up at morning, all the walls were full of cockroaches. He said it was that bad where they put us. They went and created about it and they had to send them somewhere else. He said we had some terrible lodging when we were evacuated. But they had to go whether they wanted to go or not. They hadn't a lot of choice. But we didn't have to go through all that. And then again, he was 5 years older than me, so... And at Hastings, they used to see these aeroplanes going over from Dover and that. Where they lived, it weren't far, you see. And they had a bomb in one of the pubs on a corner that got bombed. And when, after the war, when I used to go, he took me down the street to show me where this pub used to be. And it was just a bare ground then. But he said that's where that pub were that got bombed. And it was full of people and must have been awful for a lot, but as I say, we were very lucky as youngsters. We didn't see much of it. I couldn't talk about it because I didn't know about it. I didn't know what it were about, really. No, we were lucky that way. I was thankful. I went to Emmanuel School in Laurel in Bank Street, and I lived opposite the school itself when I was younger. And during playtime, when we used to play, there was a gate opposite, and my grandmother, we lived right opposite the school, and she used to come across with a cup of cocoa and a biscuit. Every playtime, she'd come across, must have watched for it, and we'd play out and I'd go to these railings and she'd come across with a cup of cocoa and a biscuit for me every afternoon. It was grand with that. I enjoyed that. And then I went to St Hilda's, which is St Wilfrid's now. I enjoyed it, and I used to play piano for them as well, because when you went in the hall during morning, you used to go in and mistress used to sing a hymn, and like they probably do it today. But I used to have to play this piano for everybody to march out to, and I did that, for about 4 years I did that. Then I was made a prefect, because I played, I suppose. The education I didn't do bad with, arithmetic and English, but there were some things I didn't know a lot about. Not like my son, that when I used to get his reports, it all said, John does not pay attention. And I used to think, well, he doesn't take any notice of me, so I know he's not going to take any notice of you. I used to think that, and I used to laugh. I used to think, well, he don't take any notice of me. Every page, John does not pay attention. He is easily led. And I used to go, yes. I used to nod. But my education, I enjoyed it. I had a sister, well, I have even now, but I don't see much of her. I haven't seen her for over 10 years. And she doesn't live here, she lives in Preston. But we went to the same school, although she's a bit younger than me. She's over 2 years younger than me. Went to the same school, but we never went together. We wouldn't play together. She had her friends and I had mine. And they used to say, why don't you go to school together? No, she can go with her mates and I'll go with my mates. She was never one that, I don't know, we weren't that close, if you like, And when we got older, they used to say, why don't you mate with your sister? I said, no, I don't want to do that. And then when I had Barbara, John and Susan, I were all right when I had Barbara. Then I had John, and she came to see him, and she turned on me and said, you're able to carry on, mine won't, because she had 3 girls, and I never saw her for 3 years. But I was thankful whatever I got, because you don't worry as long as they're all right, that's all you bother about. And now I don't speak to her, I wouldn't speak to her if I fell over her. I mean, Barbara, you only have to say that to Barbara and she'll say, yes, that's right. And it's not very long ago, only last year, that her youngest daughter died. In fact, she was 9 months older than Barbara. She would have been, if she'd have lived, 46 in December, as Barbara is 46 in September. Now, she died, and she put it in the Telegraph, Blackburn Telegraph. Other than that, I would never have known. I only found it by accident. So I rung them all. I rung Barbara, and I rung Susan, and I even rung John to tell him, and Barbara said, don't let it get to you, Mother. I said, don't worry. I said, it won't get to me. I said, I'm all right. And I didn't bother. It was no good bothering. I hadn't seen him, as I say, none of them, for over 10 years. It was like I didn't have a sister, really. You know what I mean? I mean, with that being that long since I'd seen her, it didn't affect me as it might have done if we'd have been closer. I was sorry, I mean, nobody likes to hear of anything like that, but no, we never bothered together much. And as I say, I don't see her anymore now, anyway. I don't know. I don't know where she is or what she's doing. I know she's in Preston. That's as far as I know. I haven't come to any harm, although I am on my own. It don't bother me. It don't bother me. I've plenty of friends I can ring if I need anything. They ring me. In fact, this morning I had a laugh. I got up this morning and I get dressed, well, half dressed, and go in there and have a good wash, come back out, dress myself. Well, when I've done that, I open my curtains in my kitchen. Then I come in here and I open this blind. Then I go in there in the kitchen and I make my breakfast. But I don't touch my blind until I've made my breakfast, because I can see without touching it. And it were 8:15 when I got up this morning, a bit later. Came in here, put my telly on, sat having my breakfast, and my phone rang. And it was Christine, the lady that comes to see me. She comes every Wednesday at 4 o'clock to see how I am. And it were her, and I said, yeah, what's up? She said, are you all right? Are you ill? I said, no, I'm not ill. Why? She said, well, I'm supposed to be going in town. I'm going to Morrison's, she said, but I thought, I can't go to Morrison's till I ring her up. I said, why, what's wrong? She says, you haven't lifted your blind up in your kitchen. Oh, I said, my God, I said, I forgot all about it. I said, I come here, I said, I'm enjoying my breakfast, I haven't time to bother about that, I said, well, when you put this receiver down, I said, I'll go in and do it, because you can see my kitchen window from her house. She only lives across here. I said, now, I'm going to go and do it. I said, so, have a look, and you'll know that I've pulled it up. I'm all right. She worried. She said, we're worried to death. She said, I thought you were ill. I said, no. I said, but thank you very much. I said, it's very nice to know that people worry about you. I said, thank you. But I'll have to remember to do it now, that I didn't do it this morning. But as I say, it's grand when you have friends. Even Marion that I go with on a Tuesday, her daughter will ring her mother and she'll say, tell Brenda if there's anything she wants, give me a ring and I'll do it for her. I'll get it for her if I need an errand or anything like that. They're very good. I can't grumble. I've always somebody I can, It's grand when you can do that. It's not many people that are on their own that can turn round and say, oh, she always says, Christine, across here, now if you want me, you know where I am. So that if I need anything, I only have to ring her and ask her. She's been very good. When she lived over here in Scotland Bank Terrace, he lived there with her for a couple of years. And to go to the shop, we had to go down the hill from where he lived. Well, I used to come up the hill to go to their house. Well, he'd see me coming up and he'd shout. He'd be on the balcony. He was in a masonette. And he'd shout from the balcony indoors and he'd say, Susan, I could hear him, get that kettle on. There's a little old lady coming up the road. Get kettle on. And he's always called me a little old lady. I said, it's all right. I said, what goes around, I said, comes around. I said, oh. And that's when I said, when I go, I'm going to come back, but I'm going to come back with a fly on your wall, and I'm going to watch you, and I'm going to watch you and Mark tottering around on yours in the frame. I said, you think you're going to be going off on your holidays? Then, I said, like you are now. But Mark will say, there's no thing getting out. I dread it, he said. I don't like the idea of getting out. I said, well, it happens to everybody. I said, you've no choice. I said, if you live long enough, you get old. I said, and that's all there is to it. But it's comical, is Mark and Susan, two crotchety oldies together, because he's always calling us oldies. I'll go and see the other oldie, that's his mother. I said, do you call her that to her face? Oh, no. I said, no, but you do to me. He calls me also. Keeps finding me these homes to go in. There's a lovely home at such a place. I said, well, if it's lovely, you go in it. I said, and come out and tell me what it's like, because I'm stopping where I am. I'm not going anywhere. I said, you're only trying to get rid of me. Best laugh I ever when Bernard died. I'll give you till you're 80, he said. I said, oh, well, yes, that's generous. I was 70 when Bernard died. He said, I'll give you till you're 80. I said, right. I said, but if I live as long as my gran did, I said, I'll be 97. Oh, hell, he said. I said, well, shows you. I said, shut your mouth. I'll give you 10 years, he said. I said, oh, thank you. Very kind. To be honest, I don't think of it. I used to do. I used to think, oh, what happens? But after working at Queen's Park amongst these geriatric ladies, they never went out with a bang. In other words, they weren't screaming and shouting, and they were either out of it altogether or they just went. Like Bernard did. I mean, he had this mask on, and he just said, as I said, what he said to Barbara, and he turned to me and he went, just took one breath and that were it. He didn't fight it. When you watch somebody like that, they don't fight. It's ever so peaceful, it's ever so quiet, you don't hear a thing, they don't make any fuss. And I've thought since, well, the worst part of that is suffering beforehand. Like as I said, Bernard, he had that for 12 months, cancer, and he was on morphine. And the day I went to see him, the day he died, well, we'd been every day, and on the Saturday, as he died on the Sunday, we went shopping, and we were going during the afternoon. We used to go after dinner, Anyway, I went shopping and come home, and they went home, Susan and Mark, and I got a phone call from Mark. I said, what's wrong? He said, I've had a phone call from hospital, we have to go. Your dad's had a bad night. Because he always called me Dad, and I called him Mum, because when they were little, they called me Brenda and they called him Bernard. So he said, I'll cure him. So from that day to the day he died, I got Mum and he got Dad. Always. Didn't matter where we were and who were there. I were Mum and he were Dad. That was the only time I didn't like it, is when he were ill. Because he suffered for 12 months before he died. Now, as I say, Mark rung me up. He said he's had a bad night. So we went, and when we went, he had this mask on right away. Well, he got to that stage with being on morphine. Every time we saw him, he had a television in a corner in a little room on his own. And he says, I'm watching television, it's supposed to be there, but it's not, it's up there. To him, it transferred from down here onto its ceiling. But it was the morphine and the tablets he was on that were causing all this. And when he died, as I say, he had hold of my hand and got up, squeezed my hand, he broke my fingers, because he had a strong grip, and he sat right up, and Mark ran out and shouted at sister, and she come in with another nurse, and she says to me, can I give him an injection? I said, yeah. And she gave him this injection, and she said, well, while we're here, we'll change him. Now, I always thought that they helped him. I've always thought that. Anybody on morphine, in my eyes, when they got to Bernard's stage, they were in that much pain. Now, she gave him this injection and come out to me and said, you can go in now. And he was in bed, he had a lovely white sheet on, he had this mask. So we went and sat where we were before, and we weren't there 2 minutes, and he'd gone. And I always thought that when I come away, I thought, I'm sure they helped him, because they knew he was suffering. I'm sure they do that with everybody. I don't know, I could be wrong, but where she said, can I give him an injection? And I said yes, because he were in that, I could see he were in that much pain, and he wouldn't have grabbed hold of me. He had hold of my hand, but he squeezed it more, and he sat right up in bed, and Mark run out. And I couldn't get my hand out of his, he squeezed it that much. And when he did let go of it, I couldn't open my fingers. He'd squeeze them together and I couldn't get me. Oh, horrible. Yeah, but no, he was better off. I didn't like it. It's the only thing I didn't like about it. But me, I don't think about it, to be honest with you. I know I'm 75, but in my eyes, I look at it this way, you don't know what's coming to you anyway, and when it's coming to you. I mean, as I said, my niece, she was only 45 when she died. Now, my mother was 62, and my sister, when my mother died, used to say, I don't want to get to 62. I said, why not? She said, my mother died when she was 62. I said, so? I said, it doesn't say, because she died at 62, you're going to do the same. Now, I've gone 13 years over my mother's age when my mother died. My mother died at 62 and I'm 75, and I've never thought I'm going to go tomorrow. I don't think like that. I just live one day at a time. I don't bother, I don't think about it. I don't think that far in front, because that friend of mine over there proves it. She had to go in hospital, another lady over there, Eileen. Mark knows her. She worked in the same place. She was in the kitchen, I believe, where he worked, Mark. And she used to say, I've known Mark for years. I said, yes, I know you used to work in the same place. Now, she had a lot of trouble, heart trouble, and she used to go to hospital every now and again to have a check-up, and she was a diabetic. Anyway, it ended up, she had to go to Blackpool to have an operation, and she ended up with a pacemaker. And she only had one son. That son was married, and he had a son, so she had one grandson. Now, she never looked after her grandson when he was a baby. Her daughter-in-law's mother her husband's wife's mother looked after the grandson, so she never had anything to do with him when he was younger, see. Anyway, she ends up in hospital at Blackpool, had to have a pacemaker, and her son thought, oh, she'll be all right when she comes home, but it didn't turn out like that. And in the space of 7 weeks, she's been in 3 different homes. Now, he's gone into her home and emptied it, more or less. He threw her clothes away, he threw half of her furniture away. He didn't say, I'm going to do it, he did it on his own bat. He's just done it. Hasn't said anything to his mother. Now she's ended up there and he's going away in October for a week. And my friend Christine that comes over here, he turned to her and he said, I'm going away for a week. He said, when I come back, he said, I'm going to sell my mother's house because he took her out of the home she was in, only not a fortnight since, and he took her to a solicitor to get power of attorney. And the solicitor said to him, nothing wrong with your mother. He said, if there anything wrong with your mother, she couldn't sign these papers, what I have. So I said to Christine, I said, yeah, I said, that proves to me that you don't know one day from another. You don't know how you're going to end up. She didn't know she was going to end up in a home and have to give her home up like she has. She's had to give her home up and everything else. I said, so to me, I said, I don't look like that. I said, Mark's always saying, oh, that's a lovely home for you to go in. I said, I'm not going in one of them. I'm stopping at home as long as I can. I said, you're not shoving me away. I said, I'm all right with it. You leave me. I said, if you fancy that home, you go in it and come out and tell me what it's like. I said, all the while I can send the ABCs backwards, I said, my chairs are at home. And I said that to Damon one night. And he said, what? I said, hell, he said, I can't say them forwards. And he tried to do it backwards. And he said, ZYX, and he stopped. And I said, oh, what are you doing? He said, well, I'm having to go to the beginning to get to the next one. I said, oh, you shouldn't have to do that. How do you do it? I said, I don't know, I've always been able to do it. I said, so all the time I can do that. I said, all my chairs are at home. I said, so I'm not going in any home. I said, you can't do it. I said, you're younger than I am. He started laughing. He said, I've never heard of that. I've never heard anybody do it. And I did it for him. And he laughed. He said, how did you do it? I said, I don't know. I said, I've done it for years. Why do you not get your letters mixed? I said, I don't. I said, I just do it from Z to A. I said, it just comes out right. I said, I'm more in here than what you've got. So you see, that's what they get for telling me I'm going to go in an home. I said, I'm not. I'm stopping here. You're not putting me anywhere. I'm not going. You're lucky. I said, if you get old, you're lucky. I said, my mother didn't. I said, she died when she was 62, my mother. And but I was thankful in a way because she had a heart attack. And the doctor that treated her said if she'd have come round, she'd have been a cabbage. Well, I didn't want that. I'd rather see her as she was, rather than as she ended up. I didn't want that. I brought myself round from that through thinking that way. It was no good dwelling on it. I thought, well, if she'd have lived, she wouldn't have been much use. And she'd always been active, so it wouldn't have done her any good and it wouldn't have done me any good. So that's how I got over that. You have to get over these things, whether you want to or not. You haven't got a lot of choice. You just keep plodding on and live one day at a time.
Brenda Kelly was interviewed by Ken Moss on the 30th of August 2007 in Darwin, Lancashire. Music was performed by the Grimethorpe Colliery Band, with additional music from The Century Speaks by BBC Radio Lancashire. The programme was produced by Maverick Productions.